Welcome back to Deep Talk, our podcast right here on YouTube. Today, we're serving as your explainer for a topic that's practically inescapable in the news right now: cyber warfare. It's often talked about with these totally apocalyptic undertones, right? But what does the data actually tell us about the modern digital battlefield? Today, we're going to look past the sensationalism and really demystify both the terrifying potential and the highly nuanced reality of these unseen weapons. We're going to break down exactly how they work, who's wielding them, and their real-world impact.
To get us there, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the new digital battlefield. Second, proliferation and cyber mercenaries. Third, targeting critical infrastructure. Fourth, the real economic impact. Fifth, governing the unseen war. And lastly, the cyber Cold War.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the new digital battlefield.
You know, the clashing of swords and the roar of artillery have essentially been replaced by the silent strokes of keyboards, and the escalation over just the last 2 decades has been absolutely staggering. Back in 2007, Estonia faced a massive distributed denial of service attack that totally crippled its financial institutions. It was a huge global wake-up call. Then, by 2010, the discovery of Stuxnet changed the game entirely. This was an invisible weapon, meticulously designed to physically damage centrifuges in Iran. And by 2015, we saw the very real human cost of all this when hackers compromised Ukraine's energy grid, literally plunging 230,000 people into the dark in the dead of winter.
Researchers from the Geopolitics beautifully but kind of ominously describe this era as the silent handshake of conflict. And I think that really hits the nail on the head. We're looking at a new form of warfare that totally transcends physical borders and our traditional concepts of sovereignty. The battlefield is literally everywhere and nowhere all at once.
Moving right along to Section 2, proliferation and cyber mercenaries.
What's truly alarming about this next phase of conflict is how these incredibly powerful tools are spreading. Historically, it was just highly advanced state-funded operations, but today, we're seeing a massive rise in organized cybercrime syndicates. While nation-states are spending millions developing sophisticated penetration tools, criminal groups are out there joining forces, sharing stolen data, and even renting out tools to maximize their profits. So the line between a state-sponsored attack and a purely financial criminal enterprise is getting incredibly blurry.
This rapid proliferation creates what cybersecurity experts call the boomerang effect. Here's generally how it works. Step 1. A state invests heavily to develop a super-secret zero-day exploit. Step 2. Eventually, whether through leaks or reverse engineering, that code makes its way out onto the dark web. And Step 3, those exact same advanced weapons fall into the hands of criminal organizations or rival states, and they get turned right back against their original creators.
We can see this clearly in research from the Institute for National Security Studies, which points to notorious codes like Flame and Stuxnet as perfect examples of this boomerang. Because developing these cyber weapons takes incredibly long and is super expensive, the underlying code just gets recycled. Different variations of the Flame virus actually continue to attack targets long after the original was discovered. The elite tools created for high-level espionage basically become open-source blueprints for cheaper, far more widespread attacks.
Which brings us to Section 3, targeting critical infrastructure.
So what are all these proliferating weapons actually aimed at? Well, they're targeting the very physical veins of our civilization. We're talking about the fundamental systems that keep our modern society humming. Because industrial control systems are increasingly hooked up to the internet for efficiency, our critical infrastructure, things like your local water treatment facilities, the power grid that heats your house, transportation networks, financial systems, and dams, they're all left terribly exposed.
And listen, this isn't just theoretical. Hostile actors are already out there probing these exact vulnerabilities. In 2021, a hacker attempted to remotely alter the sodium hydroxide levels at a treatment plant in Oldsmar, Florida. They were essentially trying to poison the city's water supply. And going back to 2013, hackers breached the control system of a dam in Rye Brook, New York. These unseen skirmishes are constantly testing the perimeter of our physical safety.
Let's pivot slightly to Section 4, the real economic impact. Let's just pause for a second and do a reality check. Do these cyber attacks actually cause the completely apocalyptic financial ruin we see in the movies? Well, the numbers might actually surprise you. Take the NotPetya attack back in 2017. It was widely called the most costly cyber attack in history, causing an estimated $560 million in local damage to Ukraine and billions globally. Yet when macroeconomists looked at it, they estimated it impacted only about 0.5% of Ukraine's total GDP. To put that 0.5% into perspective, cyber insurance scholars set a strict threshold for what actually constitutes a true economic catastrophe, and that's usually bounded between 0.2% and 2% of a nation's GDP. What this shows us is that while cyber attacks are incredibly disruptive and absolutely devastating to individual companies, the tangible macroeconomic damage on a national scale remains surprisingly contained. So it's a massive nuisance and a severe localized threat for sure, but it hasn't yet triggered a total economic collapse.
Okay, Section 5, Governing the Unseen War. This brings up a really massive question. If a cyber attack takes down a nation's power grid, how does the world actually govern that legally? Well, for answers, experts turn to the Tallinn Manual 2.0. This was drafted by an international group of experts at the invitation of a NATO Center of Excellence. And it's a fascinating attempt to figure out exactly how existing peacetime international law applies to these incredibly ambiguous, gray zone digital operations.
The legal nuances they debate here are just wild, particularly around the idea of sovereignty. For example, the experts agreed that physically tapping an underwater communication cable in a state's territorial waters is a clear, undeniable violation of that state's sovereignty. But hacking into a diplomatic mission's official Facebook page, legally, that does not violate sovereignty simply because a virtual embassy lacks the physical protections of a real-world building. The law is literally sprinting right now just to catch up with the technology.
Finally, Section 6, the Cyber Cold War. How do all these elements combine today? Well, we've basically entered a new era of continuous, stealthy skirmishes, where global powers are actively engaging in the digital gray zone. Impartially observing the current landscape, we see operations like Volt Typhoon, where Chinese hackers reportedly preposition bots within U.S. infrastructure for reconnaissance. We see ongoing probing between the U.S. and Iran targeting critical systems. And, of course, the extensive use of cyber operations by Russia and Ukraine alongside conventional warfare. These actions are very carefully calibrated to test defenses and signal capabilities, all without ever crossing the threshold into triggering a conventional kinetic war.
Which leaves us with this final, somewhat provocative thought to wrap up today's explainer here on Deep Talk. With millions of vulnerabilities deeply embedded in our interconnected systems, and with digital weapons becoming cheaper and more widely available by the day, we really have to ask ourselves, when this silent conflict inevitably escalates past the gray zone, are we truly ready for the world to go dark? Thank you so much for hanging out with us on the podcast today, and we'll catch you on the next one.